social construction of reality. Now, the phrase is simple enough, but that phrase doesn't give you a sense of what's going on as people have discussed that concept. In fact, there are dialogues, debates that travel now throughout the world. On every continent, you'll find debates about the social construction of reality. What's that about? Now, in the next few minutes, I'll try to give you a sense of what that's about. There's no way I can do the entire thing. It would take months. But I hope, if I can, to give you the essence and see what it's about. Because in some sense, it's about concepts like truth, objectivity, and knowledge. I mean, big ideas. Ideas that people live and die for. To know the truth, to be objective, to have knowledge. Occupations are based on those ideas. I'm a truth seeker. I'm a scientist who wants to establish objective knowledge. I'm a teacher who wants to convey that knowledge. I want to give it away. Populations must have knowledge, we say. But what is that? What is knowledge? As a first proposition, whatever there is makes no requirements about how we talk about it, how we characterize it, how we depict it. That is to say, for example, whatever this is makes no demands on us about what language we use, how we characterize it, and so on. We could talk about it as a lot of different things. We could use nonsense syllables to talk about it. We could talk about it as Charlie. We could talk about it as a bottle of water, but that's optional. Okay? Now, watch that. I mean, that seems simple enough, doesn't it? But be careful, because most of the world's peoples today will want to center in on something which this is, and that is what is true about it. That is, there's a strong tendency to delimit and narrow the range of what it is we could call that. Let's go on to a second proposition. Whatever it is that I do call this, however it is I characterize it, will not be demanded by what we'll call the thing in itself, but will grow from a set of relationships in which I'm involved, some kind of tradition, some sort of community of which I'm a part. Thus, you and I, in our sort of daily life, will call that a water bottle, a bottle of water, no problem. And we would look at that as kind of a solid object. Now, there's no, in the terms of, let's say, physics, if you were part of that community, there is no technical thing called a water bottle. It's just not a label in physics. And that would not be a solid. If we were to approach this, let's say, from the standpoint of chemistry, still there would be no bottle of water, technically. That's a humdrum day-to-day term. What we would be interested in is the chemical composition of that, and what is it in the interior, the liquid, and that which it's contained in. There would be a whole language into itself, a whole language that is used by that community to do something with that object. If I were an art historian, I might be interested in this as a quintessential modernist production. That is, the particular design feature of this comes out of a tradition which is probably 80 to 90 years old. If you designed that particular object, well, you wouldn't have the plastic, but if you designed something to be a bottle, let's say 150 years ago, it would have a quite different style. So that becomes an object for me in art history as a modernist design. Now, if I were an environmentalist, that becomes a degradation to our environment. It bears a carbon footprint that would suggest that this is an abomination. Why do we need plastics? Why do we need to import water from far distances? Why do we need to have water which is probably not very different from what we drink out of a tap in any case? So it simply becomes another thing. So in effect, what this is grows into being what it is for us out of some kind of community. Now ask yourself this. We can look at that, we can apprehend it, we can take it into account from many different perspectives. But if you abandon all the perspectives, what can you say about it? Nothing. So in effect, everything that is real for us, that is, which demands our attention for us, comes out of some kind of communal relationship. Now, I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes, but it's terribly important. Another way to say that is that we socially construct this for what it is. A third proposition that's very closely related. Whatever construction I make of that, whatever perspective I take on it, is going to bear something that we'll call values. That is, there is no value neutral construction of that. There's no value neutral description of the world. Because each one of these terms that I've used from these various, from physics, from chemistry, from environmentalism, and so on, and for us in daily life, carries with it something we want to do with it, something which it's valuable for or not valuable for. If we want to reconstruct this material, we'd like to know the chemical composition. If we want to make sure of the purity of that, whatever the liquid is, we want to know the chemical composition. That is our value, and that will lead us to describe it in certain ways as opposed to others. If we're an environmentalist, we have certain values which lead us to call this an abomination or lead us to look at it in terms of its carbon footprint that it's bearing. And similarly, if we could conceivably generate, why not, a form of religion in which that could be a holy object. We could construct it that way. And it would be valuable for us because of its sacred properties. We could bring it into worship service. We could bathe one in it at a baptism ceremony. So in effect, all descriptions will carry with them certain kinds of ways of life. Certain sorts of things that we like to do with this as opposed to others. Now, this doesn't mean that anything goes with respect to what this is. Clearly not, because once you're in a community, there are only certain things that will go and not others. If we worship it, we're not going to call it an abomination. It also means that we could, in science, carry out practices of prediction and control of that. That is, for example, in the desire to recreate that liquid elsewhere in chemical form. But in order to do that, in order to make predictions of that kind, in order to have a science, we have to have agreements. That is, we have to have communal agreements that we're going to call this, let's say, that we're going to have certain kinds of things that we're going to call chemical elements, and we're going to agree on what they are, and that's what we're going to agree on, the assays we make of it, or the descriptions we make, or the ways in which we study it, let's say, the apparatus that we'll use to make studies. And within that community, we can do things like predict. But realize that because science makes predictions, that doesn't mean that the terms of science are true. It doesn't mean they're objective. It doesn't mean they're required by the nature of the object. That is, they're just terms that are used within a certain tradition of agreement which allows you to do things like make predictions. If that's not your goal, if your goal is to have, let's say, a refreshing drink, then there are other languages that you'd want to have for that. So in effect, within a community, one can have certain kinds of, can have a science in which truth can be declared, but realize it's true with a small t. Now, I've got to add one more piece to this because it will prove important in a moment. And you might say it's a proposition which says, nothing I've said so far is true. That is, nothing I've said so far is an accurate picture, map, account of what is the case. It may seem that way, and I may have talked that way, but from a constructionist standpoint, clearly I have constructed this. It's a way of talk. So we're not out to sort of prove the truth of, or the objectivity of social construction. It's more a way of orienting in life. It's more of a way of approaching all declarations, all ways of life, as thrown constructions by people in relationship which have certain kinds of embedded values. It's not a belief system. It's not saying you are a constructionist or not a constructionist. Again, it's a way of talking, a way of writing. It's a resource that can be used or not used. And most parts of every day, you might say I'm a realist, not a constructionist. That is, I talk in terms of the bottle of water. That is, I don't question that every moment. I'm not a constructionist trying to say, well, that's an interesting construction. What way of life does that represent, and so on. But it's a resource that I can use and in fact will invite an enormous amount of creativity. How is it you keep your identity intact every day, who you are? Are you a nice person, not a nice person? Are you intelligent, not intelligent? Are you responsible and reliable, not responsible and reliable? Because all of that hinges on subtle negotiations. That little smile, that little frown, All those are communicating something to us which says you're good or you're not good, and you've got to negotiate out what those kinds of things mean in a kind of dance of negotiation in order to keep an identity intact every day. Now we do that together. Now this is kind of an interesting point. We do that together so that the words we use, the way we use them, the gestures, the way we stand, the way we position our bodies, and so on, all are negotiating. Are you valuable? Am I valuable? Am I somebody to be trusted, not to be trusted? Am I somebody to be loved or not to be loved? All of that's in a process which is in continuous motion. So in that sense, our sense of selves, our sense of who we are, really is not totally in our hands. It's in the hands of the process. And that we need each other to stay afloat each day as being an okay person. Think about that. We communicate and generate a sense of reality in almost everything we do. When I say, or when I go, there's a way in which I'm telling you something in a way which wouldn't be the same if I went, you know something is right. I mean, it's good. You're saying it's a gesture which says something. Or if I just go, it's a gesture which says something. In the same way, I think our clothing also communicates something about who we are. I mean, this is not a bright green shirt. It's trying to say something about me. I mean, take my watch, for example. It's more than just a timepiece. It actually says something about me. It probably says more than I wanted to say because there are no numbers on that watch. And why, you might ask yourself. But it's an identity marker. It's trying to express something. Three conclusions to draw from this. First of all, multiplicities of realities. That is a liberation, you might say, from the grasp of any one reality. A liberation from what you must know in order to know what the world is. A liberation from any particular perspective, because each perspective will be different. Each will bring out certain things. Each will suppress certain things. So there's nothing you must do, but here's the second conclusion, an appreciation for what's possible to do. Liberated from any singular, but appreciating the multiplicities and what they may get you. One will allow you to know where it comes from, what people have done with it. Another will allow you to know what kind of stone. Another will allow you to know how to appreciate it in terms of an aesthetic object, and so on and so on. So liberation, appreciation. And the third one is inspiration, because we are now liberated to the point that we can begin to invent what it might be. That is, We don't have to stop with the past. We are open together, and together is the important word here, to be inspired about what it could be.